Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies. I hope you have had a good lunch or rest and your coffee. After lunch session can be a little bit difficult. Right. So my name is Sally again, for those that have only attended today. So I'm the program officer for UNEP with the Law Division. So I'm the moderator for the plenary session today. And the session for this afternoon is legal responses to combat biodiversity crisis. The purpose of this session is to set the stage for stakeholders to identify legal responses to address biodiversity crisis and to go on and identify potential legal responses to combat the biodiversity crisis, focusing on addressing national and regional specific initiatives under the framework of the Montevideo Programme. To prepare the stakeholders for identification of legal responses and strategies, the first presentation will focus on the state of biodiversity in Asia-Pacific to inform the stakeholders of the current state of biodiversity in the region and to bring their attention to any emerging issues. This presentation will be followed by another presentation on leveraging multilateral and national legal measures to address the biodiversity crisis in Southeast Asia, in Asia-Pacific. The last part of the session will then introduce questions to stimulate discussions, to identify legal responses to combat the biodiversity crisis and related strategies. And that Sylvia, who's sitting next to me, will be doing that. And then it will be similar to, the next proceedings will be similar to what we had in the morning, where you'll be sent to the various breakout groups with your facilitators to discuss the different topics. We'll go into that a bit in a bit later once the presentations are over. So let me just introduce the presenters first. So for the first presentation, we have Ms. Natalie Paholiotin. She is the CEO of WWF Thailand. She joined WWF Thailand in January 2019. So WWF Thailand has been operating in the country for over 25 years and has presence in several national park and wildlife protected areas. So previously, she was working with the Education Development Center, UNDP, and IMF. Natalie is an Atlantic Fellow and a grant recipient for a short film highlighting health inequity. She also served as the board member of the Mekong Disease Surveillance Network, or MBDS Foundation. She has contributed to the establishment of a non-profit cultural center, Southeast Asia Junction in Bangkok. She is an alumni of Brown University and received her MPhil from the Sciences Po Paris. For the next speaker is Patty Moore. She is an environmental lawyer with more than 30 years international experience working in the field of environmental law and governance across more than 30 countries in Africa, Asia, Europe, and Latin America. She has been living and working in Asia since 1999. Much of her work has focused on building the legal basis for conserving and sustainable use of biological resources. Patty has assisted countries in the regions that I have mentioned and in the Middle East as well in drafting frameworks, biodiversity law, as well as laws and regulations governing ecosystem, species, and genetic resources. Then Sylvia Benko-Beza. She is a legal officer with UNEP at the Law Division, my colleague here in Nairobi. She has been an environmental lawyer at UNEP for the past 20 years, handling both national and international legal and institutional issues relating to environmental law. Her role in UNEP program ranges from providing legal support to international and national processes and instruments to provide advisory service and technical assistance to countries to assist them in the development and strengthening of their national law and institutional framework. I mean, she in herself is an institution within UNEP, I would say. So without further ado, may I invite Natalie to make the first presentation on the state of biodiversity in the Asia Pacific. Natalie, please.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I hope my presentation might give you some energy to wake up after lunch. First of all, thank you for UNEP for having me here, and I would like to present on behalf of WWF as a network on the status of biodiversity in Asia Pacific based on our latest scientific report, The Living Planet 2022. I'm going to use this for the first time, so hopefully it works. I just wanted to give a disclaimer after lunch. This presentation is not a happy one. It's really a picture of the reality of biodiversity. So unfortunately, you might remember me as the queen of doom and gloom, which might be true and may be appropriate for the double emergency we're facing today, climate crisis and biodiversity crisis. So let me just begin with the first page. Let's see if it works. Yay, it works. So I'm not going to read what's on the presentation, but I guess they can have a copy later. But if you look at the latest scientific data, which is a time series since 1970 till now, the 2022 Global Living Planet Index shows an average of 69% decrease in the relative abundance of monitored wildlife populations, and wildlife encompasses a range of wildlife. So the key point I think I'd like you all to retain for the rest of the breakout session is that in one generation, our generation, we managed to disseminate 2/3 of world wildlife and marine populations. Yes, in our generation, 2/3 gone, right? I think that is scientifically illustrated by the time series that we've had compiled since 1970. So our society is at its most important intersection in history, right? We're facing its deepest systems change. And if we don't reverse the trend now, it may be too late to reverse it. So I think this is the key message that we as WWF and other conservationists would like to share with you. Now, how about Asia Pacific, the place we call home? It's not doing much better. So you will see a steady, continual declining trend, an average decline of monitored populations of 55% taken on the aggregate. So some species are really facing a deep drop, but this is the aggregate. And the aggregate itself is quite alarming. Again, in one generation, ours, I think most of us here are born slightly before 1970 or after that. So we are here to be blamed, basically. And if you look at Asia Pacific, among the world's most biodiverse countries, so 17 of the most biodiverse countries, 5 of them are in Asia, but the loss of mangrove cover and the rate of the loss of wetlands are the highest in the world, right? So mangrove cover and loss of wetlands are the highest losses in the world. Moreover, Southeast Asia has lost over half of its original forest cover. Over half of its original forest cover, right? And the region has the highest proportion of endangered species facing extinction. So this is, again, the scientific reality. Now you will see the vibrant colors in this, I guess, cross-section of the world. And it represents the pressure points of biodiversity threats. And you will see that there are areas that are darker, the darkest being purple, and then burgundy, and then red, and then orange. And you will see that these areas also correspond to areas where there are a lot of biodiversity, especially in the Southeast Asian region. You will see a lot of purple and deep red. So again, this is where there is a lot of biodiversity, but the threats are really intensifying, and this is where the pressure points of the threats will be. And you'll probably be wondering, what are these threats? Where are they emanating from? Well, they are emanating largely from land use, changes in land use, right? Such as agriculture, linear infrastructure, mining. Wildlife trade is another threat in Asia-Pacific region, illegal wildlife trade in particular. Of course, things like pollution are also a big threat in the deep purple areas that we see and in the burgundy areas in ASEAN. Invasive species as well is another imminent threat that is mentioned in the report and linked to the analysis here. Now, what is doing the worst in terms of wildlife? Well, unfortunately, freshwater biodiversity is doing the worst. And again, if you look at the precipitous plunge in the curve, 83% of freshwater biodiversity has been lost, according to our baseline populations and measurements. That is a lot. 83% of freshwater biodiversity has been lost. And the irony is that there is only 1% or slightly less than 1% of the planet's surface is covered through fresh water. But more than 50% of the human population lives within 3 kilometers of a freshwater body. So this is a very rare natural resource that is essential to sustain human life, yet it's faring the worst in terms of biodiversity. This one, I'd like to bring us to a regional perspective to understand what are the opportunities also that lie within ASEAN. So as we know, ASEAN is a very biodiversity-rich place, and I think there are still opportunities that we could leverage. So ASEAN contains only 3% of the world's landmass, but with 18% of known flora and fauna. It has 35% of the world's mangrove forests, 28% of world's coral reef, and there are exemplary conservation efforts that are being conducted in this region, such as the Coral Triangle Initiative and the Heart of Borneo Initiative, again, transboundary conservation initiatives. Moreover, when we're talking about freshwater, which I alluded to just now, there are 26,000 kilometer squares of wetlands in 59 Ramsar sites. So this, again, is another opportunity. And 55 ASEAN heritage parks. So again, another example of potential conservation solutions that are transboundary. Yes, it's tough ahead. Like I said, I'm queen of gloom and doom. So it is tough ahead. And the challenges, like I mentioned, have been mostly attributed to changes in land use, habitat loss, degradation, fragmentation, unsustainable consumption, illegal wildlife trade, invasive alien species and diseases, zoonotic diseases, pollution, and also climate change, which I also had alluded to. And there are ways that we can reverse the loss. But again, it would be difficult, but I think it's necessary. And of course, number one, what WWF and conservation partners such as IUCN and others are doing is to increase conservation efforts where our efforts can still reverse the nature loss. In some parts, it's probably not possible anymore to reverse the nature loss, but where it's still possible, those areas have to be prioritized. 2, work with the private sector for sustainable production and consumption. 3, what we're doing today is promote and protect the right to a healthy environment. So using legal frameworks that are available. And 4, of course, using the multilateral engagement platform, which is working with regions and through cross-border cooperation. And this is going to be my last slide. I just wanted to emphasize that as as the legal knowledge is here and as you're using the legal platform to push through, we from a conservation network would like to, underline the fact that we do have to protect the environment, but through a rights-based approach, making sure that any conservation or environmental protection efforts include inclusion and a rights-based approach for inclusivity. So especially with indigenous populations who make up a large majority of shareholders working in conserved or in national parks in Asia. And like everything we do, WWF, we believe that partnerships are key. The drivers of biodiversity loss are complex and cross-cutting, so there's no simple single solution. And therefore, as we like to say, together possible, we have to do it with other people. We have to reach out to unusual bedfellows and partners sometimes we do not normally talk to, but that is essential to reverse the loss in biodiversity and, of course, mitigate the risks of climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Natalie. That is really depressing to look at the figures. And after all the doom and gloom, question is what can we do? As we can see, much of the crisis is human-made, caused by human activities. Now, it's not about blaming ourselves, but it also means that we hold the key to the solution as well. So we are in control of this if we want to be. And Patty will speak a little bit as to, what we can do, what we can leverage on in terms of multilateral and national legal legislation and framework to address the biodiversity crisis. Patty, to you.
Thank you, Sally, and thank you, Natalie, I guess, for doom and gloom. And thank you also, UNEP. It's really a pleasure to be here today with this group and to meet all of you. And Natalie was saying she's doom and gloom. In one way, what we're going to talk about now is the status of the legal measures that would help us combat this biodiversity crisis in the Asia-Pacific region. So the good news is there are actually a lot of them. Do you know what I mean? In virtually every country. The bad news is we've had some of them for 50 years, and we're in the situation today that Natalie has just described. So what we're going to look at right now really is just going to be, again, a status, it's a snapshot of what the existing legal measures are, and then try to put that in the context of both the Global Biodiversity Framework and then also the Montevideo Programme, of course. So first of all, this is a starting point for biodiversity. These are global biodiversity targets. This is the way it's set out in the Global Biodiversity Framework and actually in this order. So when in the threats column, the threats are the last four. And of course, this language is shorthand because each of these is about a paragraph in the actual framework. But in the bottom four threats, you see pollution and climate change. And those two, along with loss of biodiversity, constitute what's being called now as the triple planetary crisis. So we heard from Bryony this morning about pollution. About climate change, and you all have discussed that at length. And we're going to be looking at that again a little bit in this context. What can be done to reduce the threats? Those are things that Natalie has already described. And then the other targets for meeting people's needs, essentially what we're talking about here this afternoon is the very last point in that, which is looking at effective legal policy and administrative measures. So where do we start? Okay, we're gonna look at the multilateral landscape, starting at the global level. Then we'll go multilateral at the sub-regional level, and then we'll look at what individual countries have. So this is the status. as of, as of the last time, a lot of these things were updated, whether both on clearinghouse mechanisms and in, in other databases. But what you see here, where there's an X, it means that, the country here is a party to that particular one. And in the case of the Climate Change Convention, all of the countries here are also parties to the Paris Agreement. And you'll see that not only for Southeast Asia and ASEAN, I'm starting with that because we're sitting here in Southeast Asia, but the three Rio conventions, the CBD, the CCD, which is the Convention on Combating Desertification, and the Climate Change Convention, are all, all of the countries in this entire region are parties. No, that's not, obviously, you can see here that's not the case. And it's also not the case for the two protocols to the CBD. And you'll see here in ASEAN and then subsequently that it's the Nagoya Protocol on access to genetic resources and benefit sharing that has fewer parties than several of the other agreements. The way this is structured, then you have the Ramsar Convention on wetlands and the World Heritage Convention, which both deal more or less with ecosystems, types of ecosystems. CITES and the Convention on Migratory Species, which deal with species. And then Nagoya and the Cartagena Protocol, of course, deal with genetic resources. So you can also see in Southeast Asia, there's only one country that is a party to the Convention on Migratory Species, even though there are like numbers of migratory species that actually transit this region on, on a regular basis. Okay, so now looking at South Asia. Here, well, we can just start with CMS. Look how many more countries in South Asia are parties to the Convention on Migratory Species. Is that something that could be leveraged here? Do you know what I mean? So these are just looking at the way countries have chosen to become a party to an agreement or not, says something about priorities in the country, because each country has its development priorities, its financial priorities, and they make their decisions on that basis. But that's something to ask yourself as you're looking at this. Again, you see here that Nagoya, relative to the others, is somewhat, has somewhat fewer parties than the other agreements. Now look at Northeast Asia. Here, again, as with Southeast Asia, one party to the Convention on Migratory Species, although we know that there are migratory species transiting those countries, like regularly, seasonally. But otherwise, fairly good coverage in terms of being parties to the other global multilateral environmental agreements. And finally, the Pacific, and unfortunately, we don't have anybody with us from the Pacific here today. And obviously, this is a lot more countries. But you can see here there are 3 countries in the Pacific that are parties to basically all of these agreements. That's Fiji, Samoa, and Palau. And the others have, again, like fewer of them have become parties to Nagoya. And again, you see with the Convention on Migratory Species, relatively few are parties. But also, if you look at this, CITES and CMS, both of the global agreements on species, have relatively fewer parties in the Pacific, which is also something to keep in mind when we're thinking about what approaches could be in sub-regionally. So now we're going to look at sub-regional agreements, because this gets a little bit closer to home. There's one, SAARC is the South Asia Association for Regional Cooperation, for those of you who are not from South Asia. And there is a SAARC convention on cooperation. All of the SAARC countries are parties, and this agreement has been in force for 10 years now. But the agreement is only on cooperation. That's the only substantive obligation, is to cooperate. The agreement itself has a fairly comprehensive list of issues on which parties will cooperate, but there are no substantive requirements with respect to those to those particular issues in biodiversity conservation. There are two sub-regional agreements in the Pacific, and you can see one of them is almost 50 years old. The other one's almost 40 years old. They both finally came into force about 30 years ago. The Noumea Convention primarily focuses on marine pollution. There are some substantive obligations with respect to other issues as well, and we're going to look at the actual substantive content of the agreements in a minute. The Apia Convention really focuses on protected areas. That's the focus. And all of the substantive obligations in the Apia Convention are in relation to the protected areas. And then, now this one I've put in here, it's not in force. This is the ASEAN agreement. It was signed by all of the ASEAN members at the time, but it is not yet in force because it requires 6 ratifications before it comes into force. But I've put it in here because there are issues, particularly genetic resources, on which this ASEAN agreement was ahead of its time, you know, like ahead of the CBD even, on issues, yeah, as I said, like genetic resources. So that I've kept this in here so that we can just look at what the countries in Southeast Asia were actually considering almost 40 years ago, and actually signed on to almost 40 years ago, but have not since ratified and put into force. So now this is looking at the substantive content, what's actually in these agreements. And there are 2 slides that will ask you to look at this. This first one covers basically the 3 components of biodiversity: ecosystems, species, and genetic resources. And you can see that that biodiversity isn't even mentioned in the older ones because it wasn't even a term that was being used at the time these agreements were drafted and came into force. The only one of these regional agreements that actually does mention biodiversity is the SARC Convention. And you can see that there is coverage. All of them cover ecosystems in one way or another. The SARC Convention, for example, only specifically refers to mountain ecosystems, but it does cover ecosystems. Some are more specific, vegetation and forests. Some look at soil, water. Again, with species, they're not comprehensive in that sense. Obviously, the Apia Convention, even though it's focusing on ecosystems and protected areas, it does have substantive obligations related to indigenous species in those protected areas. So these are just some fine differences that don't show up on a table like this. You can see that when we get down to the bottom, genetic resources, again, as I mentioned earlier, the only sub-regional agreement that has any mention of genetic resources is the agreement that's not in force, which is the ASEAN agreement. Here again, now this is what's the content of these sub-regional agreements after we go through looking at the 3 components of biodiversity. 2 minutes. Okay, we'll go fast. So let me see. Okay, go through this more quickly. But you can see toward the bottom of this slide that there are particular issues that come up in the strategic activities under the Montevideo program that have to do with cooperation, research, education, and participation. So those things, you can see they are not particularly well represented in these sub-regional agreements. And look at participation. Again, the only sub-regional agreement that even mentions it is the one that's not in force. Again, here, training is another issue among the strategic activities for the Montevideo program. And that's only mentioned in one, and in fact, it's the oldest one of these regional agreements. And you can see, but what's interesting, if you look here, is that 2 of the regional agreements in force deal with coastal zone management. more than anything else except for ecosystems, coastal zone management. Now we're looking at national laws, and we'll just go through this quickly, but generally, there are very few dedicated laws to biodiversity in any of the subregions. In the countries where there is a biodiversity law, in many cases there will not be a law on access to genetic resources and benefit sharing because it's covered in the biodiversity law. So there won't be a separate law on that. No? But that's not always the case, because you see in the Philippines that, well, they, you know, where they have an ABS law and a biosafety law, but not a biodiversity law. So Vietnam, however, has a biodiversity law, and it also has regulated ABS separately. Again, in South Asia, for example, Bangladesh, Bhutan, and India all regulate access to genetic resources and benefit sharing through their biosafety law. Wetlands, as you can see in all of these, has probably the least legislative coverage of the ecosystems of any of these issues. Fisheries, forests and fisheries, the traditional issues, are generally fairly well covered, but that doesn't mean these laws are up to date or that they have provisions on the other issues that we're looking at. Here for Northeast Asia, similar, you can see they're almost all, the parties to almost all of these, or the national laws cover almost all of these. And in the Pacific, again, there are no dedicated biodiversity laws in the Pacific, nothing specific yet on access to genetic resources and benefit sharing in the Pacific, but not surprisingly, fisheries is well covered in the Pacific. So the Global Biodiversity Framework actually proposes a long list of tools and solutions. The very first one, the very top one, is integration, and that's exactly what Bryony was talking about today. The hard work, because this means rethinking. This means getting out of the silos. This means taking everything that every country, virtually everywhere, not just in these subregions, has been doing for a long, long time. And so you can see again, these tools and solutions pick up issues that are substantive, that are strategic activities for the Montevideo 5 program: information, collective action or partnerships, participation. But remember, the participation doesn't really show up in any of the sub-regional agreements in force. And I want to pick up two of those solutions from GBF. One is reforming incentives and subsidies, and that's also a little bit of what Bryony was talking about. Yes, I've got one more slide, I promise I'll talk fast. I'm trying not to talk too fast. Incentives and subsidies, and also finance, but not, as Baba was saying this morning, not finance in the sense of having enough money, but finance in the sense of the way fiscal laws are structured. And we're looking particularly at, this means that the laws that are probably generating the most adverse impacts on biodiversity tend not to be laws that are actually directly regulating biodiversity. So we're looking at land laws, agriculture laws, rural development laws, water resource laws, oil and gas, obviously, mining as well, and then the fiscal laws. And the reason I put fiscal laws on here is because these, it's not even laws in several countries, it's at the level of relatively minor internal ministerial notifications or regulations that determine how money actually moves through a government system. And if there are obstacles to money moving through a government system, no matter how much money you throw at the problem, it won't go away. So those kinds of things that biodiversity lawyers are not used to really looking at, and if we don't start doing that, we're going to lose more than what Natalie has already told us about. And finally, this is the thank you slide, but there's one more thing, and that we have not brought up in this, because we've talked about the legal measures here and the actual, like the science of biodiversity, but we haven't talked about the social and political issues, and those are always present. particularly when human beings are making law. No, that's what guides it. You can draft a perfect law, and by the time it goes through the political process, it's fairly unrecognizable by the time it comes out the other end. So those are things that we're not going to talk about here, in this panel, I don't think, but there will be things that you'll be keeping in mind as you have your discussions this afternoon on how to approach these strategic activities that are highlighted in the Montevideo program, whether it's law reform or research or promoting participation at the global and sub-regional level. So now I will say thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Patty, for giving such an immense overview of the frameworks, international and national framework. And I think that justified at least half a day of workshop. So maybe we'll plan that, Georgie. But yes, thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Patty, for really putting down the status quo of where we are with the biodiversity crisis. And it is a crisis. So now we will be able to do something by having that group discussion like what we did this morning, right? And really think about what we can do to find the solution to the biodiversity crisis. And I'll keep repeating biodiversity crisis because it is a crisis. Let's not talk about biodiversity loss because it's beyond that now. So with that, I'm passing the mic over to Sylvia, who would guide you through, give you a little briefing on what the discussion should be, the framework of the discussions in your breakout group, and then we'll send you off to your respective room and groups with your facilitator. Sylvia?
Yes, good afternoon. I'll bring in the UNEP context and the legal responses that the Montevideo focal points considered last year in June 2022. So my outline will involve the introduction and agreed legal response of addressing biodiversity loss, defining clear priority areas to address biodiversity loss, structuring options for consideration, and challenges, opportunities, next steps, and looking ahead. So the introduction is about defining clear priority areas for addressing biodiversity loss for 2024 to 2029. Because whatever you're going to identify now will be presented to the Montevideo focal points. Some of you will be there to approve those areas, biodiversity areas, and then after that, that's when the implementation will start. And of course, we have until 2029. And another window that we'll have, of course, is the fact that we are also implementing SDGs. SDG 15 is about biodiversity. So it's the same line, and SDG is about not leaving anybody behind. So though some of the MEAs have not mentioned anything about participation, then you should be able to understand that you are not going to leave anyone behind. And of course, the GBF also said it's the whole of government and the whole of society that will implement the GBF, so you are not leaving anyone behind in the implementation in terms of the stakeholders that will be involved. So the scope of biodiversity is very broad, covering terrestrial resources, freshwater resources, marine and coastal environment, as well as global biodiversity-related MEAs, including regional and sub-regional instruments relating to natural resources. We have already heard about that. But I just wanted to pull out now the real issues, as Patty already said, the 2022 GBF and the process of updating NBSAPs after the adoption of the Global Biodiversity Framework. All countries are in that. They are being engaged, I know, by the MEA Secretariat, the GEF, there are some GF projects that are supporting that, needs assessment and all that. So I just wanted us to know that this is a process that is engaging almost all countries in this area, developing countries. And also important as far as emerging issues in biodiversity is concerned is the BBNJ, the agreement that was adopted this year. Yeah, and then what we need now is effective legal frameworks on biodiversity. UNEP is inviting all of you, if you have any issues relating to national legislation relating to biodiversity, then you can apply through LEAP. Within UNEP, there are a lot of areas and projects that deal with biodiversity. In relation to ABS, there are some GF projects that are supporting countries. There's a huge biosafety project that is supporting also many, many countries to implement and to do it through their clearinghouse to help them also report on their developments in the clearinghouse of the Biosafety Convention. And also we are working with, of course, MEA focal points at the Secretariat and MEA focal points at the national level also to come up with some of these priority areas. But as you know, biodiversity is also very broad. So FAO deals with also some parts of biodiversity, all issues relating forestry, agriculture, and FAO, fisheries as well. But we are also working together in a lot of this work. Recently, we were working on CITES, implementing legislation, trying to harmonize that with fisheries-related legislation. And there's a guide on that that is available for that. So legislation is also not in silos. We have started working to ensure that biodiversity laws also include climate change laws and consider such issues. And one of the other priority areas that we were given by Montevideo Focal Point meeting was the transboundary crimes issue. It has been there, of course. Illegal trade and illegal traffic issues are in every part of MEAs. So we were asked also to consider that. So even as you go to your groups, then think about that. And of course, in that, there was some terminologies about transboundary crimes and crimes against the environment and whether criminal issues should be left to government. But the aspect of criminal issues was already adopted as a legal response, as we'll see here. So there's a nexus between biodiversity and climate change, and a nexus between biodiversity and chemicals. That's why we're saying the triple planetary crisis is of biodiversity, pollution, and climate change. There's an interconnection between the three. So it's not that it works just independently of biodiversity. So you'll find that even in the marine and coastal area issues, you'll always find issues related to climate change impact, and you have to legislate towards that. So maybe as we were advised this morning, we should be moving in that direction. So we are also waiting for a chemicals and waste framework, which is being developed under SICAM, which is going to be ready in September this year. So we'll consider whatever comes from there, but you can look at the draft framework that is already in the SICAM website now, which considers the chemicals and waste. So we'll be looking at this together with the Global Biodiversity Framework to see what are the new areas that we can also consider. And in the Global Biodiversity Framework, there are issues like nature-based solutions that have been adopted there as part of the solutions, and some of which we have started looking at. And there are also other issues, like we were talking about the digital sequence information, that are being considered differently in other names, especially with where the WHO pandemic convention is being organized. They are considering the same thing, it's calling it different names. So UNEP will be also looking at those areas on the legal aspects. Yeah, so the legal responses that are already agreed, that we don't expect you to open up, is a general thing. Legal responses to enhance compliance with and enforcement of biodiversity-related laws, including criminal laws and institutions. This was already identified by focal points. It's not, so it's not a subject of discussion, but because yesterday most of you were raising issues of enforcement and compliance. So this will be considered. So the second issue was, why do we have these consultations? Because we want to identify options for clearly defined priority areas to strengthen, develop, or implement appropriate legal and institutional frameworks at national and subnational level to implement biodiversity-related goals and commitments. So the goals are everywhere, and commitments are everywhere. So let's see where are the gaps that we need to implement, and try to document that for the Montevideo Focal Point meetings and for the future program of Montevideo Programme V. 2 minutes. So we were suggesting that if you look at the old Montevideo Programme 3, this morning we were told Montevideo has been here for 40 years. Montevideo Programme 3 and Montevideo Programme 4 can inform us, help us as we think about how to structure what we can get. But I realize that we don't have much time. No. So maybe we should just focus on the questions that were given this morning. But On your time, whenever you have time, please read the old Montevideos, especially 3 and 4. They'll give you an idea of creating such programs of biodiversity and others. Those were broader because they were covering 10 years, but at least they give you an idea of what we are looking for. So they were structured in such a way that you provide an objective of that area that you want to have as a priority area. You have to have a strategy on how you're going to get it, and of course a set of activities. But we already have this structure of activities, so we don't have to go back to it. Yeah, so these are the questions, but they are more refined in the rooms that we are all going to be.
There's a
PowerPoint on that. Yeah, so we are defining priority areas relating to national legislation, legal frameworks at the regional, and gaps at the regional and sub-regional level. And we are relying on SDGs and GPF. And then, of course, I wanted to remind you of the issue of national legislation in relation to LEAP request. And then, secondly, the other priorities on capacity building. And as we said yesterday, capacity building is not only training. Capacity building can be also providing platform for sharing information, generating best practices and such issues, and other issues that can be provided in capacity building. Identifying gaps in knowledge products, and of course, developing the partnerships with MEA, focal points, and others. So I think that's all. Yeah, and the different target groups and all that. I think you'll get this presentation. The rest is not important. Next steps after what we do, I've already said, collate all defined priority areas on biodiversity from all regional consultations. We are not only consulting you, we'll be consulting Africa and Latin America, as you heard this morning. And then you use the identified legal responses from all regional officers to present them to the second meeting of national focal points. You will all be there, and then the next thing, whatever will be approved now, will be implemented as legal responses to address biodiversity loss. So what are the organizers looking up to all participants on? Constructive engagement, which is well thought through and highly interactive on legal responses to address biodiversity loss. Specific country needs for strengthening laws or institutions relating to biodiversity can be expressed at this stage. Regional specific needs, if any, can also be included. Yeah. Many thanks. Sorry for taking much of your time.
No, you can also repeat this in the what you call that, closing, because I think that's something that you will be summarizing as well at the end of today's session.
Yes.
So we can go into a bit more details on that. Oh, am I too soft?
No, it was just another mic was on.
All right. Okay. I'm just wondering, Kumpom, can you show the slide for the breakout session so that people can see? Yeah. Okay. Just so that you can see where you're going. So we're going to switch it around a little bit because we had a discussion about you not having to focus on the same issue on, say, capacity building in the yellow group and something else. So we move you around in terms of topics, right? But also for yellow and green, this time you stay here. And then for orange and blue, you will go to room A, okay? And you will still stay with the same team. So if you are yellow, you're still going to be yellow and green, etc., etc. But these are the topics that you will have. Let me see if there's... It will be shown in room A as well, so don't worry about it. So the breakout group set questions are very similar to what you have this morning. You can also refer to the online survey questions, which I think I have copies that we can distribute to the facilitators who will share with you. Some of the questions will be useful in terms of how you frame your discussion as well, so do use that. And don't forget to appoint a team lead for your group, as well as a note taker who usually end up being the rapporteur as well. just so that you can report back. You've done this in the morning, so you're an expert on it now. Can I just also encourage the participants online as well as the ones in person, if you have an opportunity, please fill up the survey form. Do we have the QR code somewhere? I don't think it's here. Maybe we'll flash it in during the breakout session. Do fill it up for the online participants, because both for the climate change as well, climate crisis, as well as the biodiversity crisis, so that we can take all your comments, which are very valuable to us in terms of how we move forward to the next steps. So I've also encouraged the people, the in-person participants as well, because you could then be very specific about what your issues are and what your specific solutions are to your country or your organization. So I think that's it. The facilitators, can you lead for orange and blue? Please lead your teams to the room A. You have slightly less than 1 hour, I'm sorry. Please, you can go for your break at 3 o'clock, so just mind the timing. We go now. Yes.